I'm probably going to do something slightly different than the last couple of talks that you've heard. And hopefully before lunch, I can leave you with a different viewpoint and maybe infect you with a more chaotic headspace just in time for a generative post-assembly discussion later. So a quick intro. I'm Kara. I'm a researcher with Other Internet. I recently got to be a part of the Summer of Protocols Fellowship with Venkat as well. I'm a producer for a variety of immersive and interactive types of experiences. I'm leaving that vague and saying game type things intentionally because a lot of them are kind of in a gray area between games and other content. I'm also a co-founder of Team Rolfus, which is an experimental performance and real-time animation studio. So throughout this talk, I'm going to be throwing a lot of images up and referencing a lot of different things. I am happy to share links if you want to reach out to me on Telegram after the talk. So a little bit about me. I just wanted to, since a lot of us in this room like games, just wanted to provide you with some context on where I'm coming from and some games that have inspired me and what types of media I enjoy and like to think about when I'm thinking about story and narrative. So I'm very glad to be here. I've been a fan of Trust and Moving Castles for a long time, and it's been very exciting to hear about everybody's different ideas about what autonomous worlds could be. A lot of my thinking on the subject is influenced by my work history in immersive entertainment. And so a few years back, I worked at Meow Wolf, which is a big immersive installation in New Mexico. I was an interactive producer for them. And so this is a really big physical space that has a storyline that you can kind of explore in an environment, characters that you can interact with, and different pieces of ephemera that are scattered throughout the exhibition that you can kind of explore to see a certain story world. So it's a real building that's formatted kind of similarly to a video game. And so as they expanded, they were thinking of other ways to deliver narrative other than the physical objects or characters that you might interact with. And they started combining in different forms of media, AR and VR, trying to personalize digital content to go along with your experience in the space. And so I specifically was working on projects that were trying to bridge as many of those things as possible. So that is the context that I'm coming from. And in that, as you're thinking about all of those different types of media and how you might bridge that into a single story experience, you might see that it could become a pretty complicated design problem pretty quickly. So how do you create a meaningful narrative when everyone is entering from a different viewpoint, experiencing different pieces of information? How do you tell cohesive stories when there are all different levels of participation? So people are exploring the space in completely different ways. There are people who are completionists. They're reading every single piece of text. They're spending hours there. There are people who are there to take a single Instagram photo. It just totally depends. And so how do you tell a story in a space that's that variable? I've also worked in ARGs. And so for those who aren't aware, ARGs are alternate reality games. So I've produced a couple alternate reality games, and those tend to be network narratives that are in a collection of real world environments in addition to platforms and different locations online. And so they usually have some role-playing elements, and they're meant to be experienced as a combination of layered fiction and real interactions that take place. So if you're in one, you'd probably hear some version of oh no, this is real. This is not a game. This is real. And you are probably aware of ARGs. Maybe in this room, people are aware of ARGs because they're very big in both games marketing and crypto marketing. So it's a small fan base, but I feel like the fan base is probably here at this event. So there are a lot of approaches and different definitions for these kinds of games, but they're usually multi-platform. They usually involve interactions between different players and the game creator. And then this is another type of game that similarly reckons with multiple entry points, modes of experiencing content, and levels of participation. They are complicated to talk about. I did not do a great job of defining them right there, but even the ARG white paper that the ARG community wrote about itself in 2006 was extremely controversial and resulted in a schism in the community. So point being, I've spent a long time working in different spaces where people are confused about the words worlds, games, and how different mediums overlap and interact with reality. So I've been feeling during this event some kinds of echoes of those same themes happening as we all talk about decentralized narratives, story worlds, what all of these terms mean. There have been some very good definitions, and I really liked a lot that Jay put forward earlier today. But it can be easy to get bogged down in the specific ideas of what these terms mean and not necessarily the big picture of it. So, autonomous worlds. How can you think about narrative and storytelling if all the participants are having the option to pilot or make changes to the world? And so, in general, this talk, what I kind of want to do is create a different perspective on the types of things we've been hearing about this morning. So to try to take us as far as possible outside of the typical advice for creating games or creating narratives, and take us into not overthinking and creating a little bit of chaos, being willing to lean into some of the uncertainty that exists when you have a lot of people experiencing something differently in the same shared collective experience. Autonomous worlds are a little bit complicated to think about, and hopefully we can answer every single thing about them later today in the post-assembly. This don't overthink slide, this is kind of in the spirit of the intellectual honesty, and it's from my personal experience of trying to design narratives like these. It can be very complicated and very easy to spend a lot of time like trying to account for every possibility or trying to design something that is perfect, has a perfect mechanism, functions in a very efficient way. And I think especially in this room, we're predisposed to things like that. And trying to understand all of the dynamics at play in different community interactions, types of narrative design, types of participation, it's almost impossible to do in a truly autonomous shared environment. And so in my mind, what we'll cover is like strategies for how to exist messily in living worlds. How can people take some of the usual narrative or game design tools and frameworks and apply them imperfectly to the idea of decentralized narratives? So hopefully we can start by not world building so much. Kind of. So this one is something that I sort of believe. It depends on what you're making. And there's obviously a lot of different types of experiences that you can work with. But I think it's something that we all fall into where there's a temptation when you're making something to really intricately create every detail of it and to create something totally holistic, airtight. You're going through all of these different categories. You're setting up a full world. When we hear the word world, we often think about something that is that cohesive, holistic thing, like it is a contained thing. But as we've talked about in a couple of the past panels and talks, like a lot of worlds are a little bit blurrier and fuzzier than that. And so as we start talking about more autonomous versions of media, leaning too hard into world building can mean forgetting to account for the people interacting with each other and the content in ways that spills over into other worlds or into reality. So obviously this is way more true once things get decentralized. So instead of starting a process of thinking about narrative with a highly detailed and contained world, I'd encourage you to try to break outside of whatever boundaries or containers you have in your head when you're thinking about a game that you're creating or that you're participating in. So you have to preemptively escape. You have to expand the frame a little bit. I liked Venkat's framing about abstraction leaks and how leak-proof worlds are actually not that desirable. It's important to expand the frame of what you're viewing as a world and try to see it from as many different perspectives and experiences as possible. So say you have a game and you have players interacting in the game. Is that a world? Or is the world the game plus the paratextual activities that take place around it? So it's the game plus the YouTubers talking about the game, plus the lore that's being documented on a fandom wiki and the fights that are happening about the fandom wiki. And maybe as well, it's the OCs and mods and like speedrunning rule sets that are built around it, or any number of other activities that people who are in the world are kind of exporting from the source media into their real lives and like creating new points of entry for other players as well. So some of the early writing on autonomous worlds references this as something that can be defined and encoded in a hard way, It's called Hard Diegetic Boundaries, I believe, in one of the pieces. And I don't so much agree with that as a concept. Like, I think a lot of the diegetic boundaries that exist are way fuzzier than we would want to think. And it's not as realistic to be able to think of them as something that have like a stable entry rule or a stable rule for what can be considered diegetic or what can be considered canon. I think that's something that's very much negotiated by all of the people sharing a space together. So I think that this matches up very well with what Jay was saying earlier about how you are making sense of the world depends on like where you're standing. And everyone is standing at a different place in these worlds. So once you've expanded the frame, it starts feeling painful, probably, to think about all of the different possibilities that there are. So narrative is a extremely chaotic design space when you've started thinking this way. Anything is possible. Anyone could be doing anything at any time. And that's when I like to bring back some existing design tools. So there are things that are like very commonly accepted, fun game design prompts, tools, or frameworks that can still be useful in this more chaotic space. You just have to apply them a little bit differently and be okay with a certain form of imperfection with it. And so this is, you've probably seen this a few times by now, but this is the Bartle's player types taxonomy. And so this is a 90s framework for how you might think about player behavior in MMOs. So what I like to do is try to think about how something like this might apply in a poorly bounded ungame type of thing. So let's say you're in a more of like a mixed reality type of context. And what I mean by that isn't like the mixed reality term where it's AR and VR. I mean like it's a mix between a fictional world and reality in some way. So it might look like, let's see. So like on the explorer side, an explorer in the game is typically collecting objects. They're running around there trying to experience as many of the little pieces of the game as possible. So in a fandom, like inside of a game fandom, not a game, an explorer might be a type of player who collects who does librarian style work and collects some of the tutorial or wiki content, and they might look for secrets or hidden information about the development process of a game. They might look for the behind-the-scenes details and get really into that nitty-gritty back end of things. And so it's important to consider why people might enjoy participating in systems like this. It's not always incentive structures that seem rational from an external viewpoint. People have these different motivations, no matter what layers of fiction or reality you're designing for. In a similar way, what might it look like if someone is a killer in a fandom? That one is something we've all definitely heard a lot about. Like maybe in music fandoms, you've seen stan culture happen. You've seen people potentially dox each other. You've seen people have adversarial relationships with each other online. I have a friend who likes to talk about Twitter as a PvP zone. And I think that this is this is very accurate, and it kind of gets to the heart of like how people can play things that are not traditionally viewed as games. And so there are people who play in a killer style online. They might be doxing each other, spreading negative information. They might be trying to negatively influence like someone's job, someone's real life. They might be swatting people. So these are all like non-traditional environments of play, but areas where people are playing nonetheless. And so, like, is this a world? Is this the world? It's kind of difficult to draw boundaries around things like that. And so this is a tool that can kind of help us expand the frame without getting too lost in the details. It's not a perfect fit onto thinking about, like, I guess, psychology and how people operate in a world. But as you're thinking about how a autonomous world could function and how a narrative in an autonomous world could function, what you're really thinking about is how groups of people are operating together and what they might be interested in doing when they're operating in a shared context. So I think another very useful tool for thinking about autonomous worlds in general is a specific subreddit called Hobby Drama. I think that this is almost more useful than like so many game design resources for thinking about autonomous narrative in general, because what this subreddit does is it's a collection of people submitting long-form historical posts of drama that has happened in their fandom. And so a lot of the stories that we've heard at this conference could fit into hobby drama pretty easily, or might already be posted there. Each of these is you'll notice that they're tagged with usually a source of the content that they're pulled from, the fandom, the platform, wherever the people are gathered together and actually interacting with each other. But then if you're reading through them, you'll notice that it's usually a mix of that original content and then how the drama has unfolded within a community. So you can really see kind of like what the dynamics are in shared social worlds based off of this. They usually start with a shared interest, and quickly it spreads into formats, it spreads across social groups, and sometimes, in the case of the bottom left in particular, it spreads into international affairs. So this one is a piece of video game drama that happened a couple years back of someone debating the accuracy of a certain tank that was featured in a game. There was a very long and drawn-out argument about whether this tank was realistic and whether the redesign of the tank was actually matching up with how the tank was in real life. Someone who worked in the British military actually posted schematics of the tank online, and there was a lot of debate of like, is that real? Like, did they really just post like secrets, national secrets online? They did. And so I'm not exactly sure how that ended, but it really does show that like there are these pieces of worlds that are fictional worlds. They're designed worlds that can bleed over, both reality bleeds into them with the inspiration of a real tank, and then they can transfer back into the real world pretty easily through these social dramas and outputs. And so I guess like as you're thinking about building autonomous worlds, one question that is top of mind for me is like, what is the difference between wanting to build a world or a narrative versus wanting to participate in one? Especially thinking about in a truly autonomous environment, there shouldn't be so much of a difference between wanting to create your own narrative in a new world versus wanting to affect one in an existing world. So the other design strategy that I've used in the past for things like this is to start playing more in the existing spaces that there are. And so instead of thinking of something as world building or as an entirely new game design, something that you're controlling in a top-down manner, like you need to start interacting more as though you are a piece of a fandom or a part of the world, and seeing what efficacy and what agency you have as a member of that group. And again, like this is a good resource for that, because you can kind of see a library of actions that you can take. You can kind of start to see, oh, maybe I should dox someone on Twitter. I don't do that. But like maybe I should like get a group of people together and start telling a story or create a new rule set of some kind. I really like the idea that like in a truly autonomous world, like there are more win conditions and therefore less interest in aiming for any of those win conditions. I think that the stickiness comes from like going back to those player types, creating a social experience or creating something that's interesting to collect, to kind of meet all of those kind of core desires that keep people playing games. And so a thought that I would want to leave you with is that games are tools for making metagames. And this is kind of like the core principle that I try to approach design with for different experiences. You aren't making one contained thing. You aren't making content that fits within something that has boundaries that can't be permeated. You're making a tool for other people to interact with and make their own game on top of. And I think that that's like the most interesting part of everything that I've heard in the past few days for me. So as a question for the panel this afternoon, or for the post-assembly this afternoon, I would say, like, what are some ways that in the worlds that you're a part of right now, you could create your own type of game within them or create your own new win condition? Like, what could you do to interact with the worlds that you are a part of now that is different than how you might, say, world build or design your own new world? Thank you.